and welcome to First Look, a Bible study looking ahead to the reading or readings for the coming Sunday. My name is Carl, and it's good to have you with us. This week, we're exploring some of Jesus' teaching around money and a parable he tells in response to a man who wanted him to settle a dispute about inheritance. Before we get started, however, if you've not done so already, you may find it useful to download the sheet accompanying this study, and you'll find the link for that in the YouTube video description. On the sheet you will find the text of today's reading, some other passages you may wish to look up, the questions we'll be considering together later on, and lots of room for you to record your own thoughts and observations. And so, without further ado, let's dive into today's passage, which comes from Luke's Gospel, chapter 12, verses 13 to 21. We're continuing to work our way through the travel narrative of Luke's Gospel, which begins in chapter 9, verse 51 and goes all the way through to chapter 19, verse 27. And it's a section of Luke's Gospel that contains a great deal of Jesus' teaching, and indeed in what we're thinking about today and what follows from it, quite a bit of teaching around money. Immediately prior to this, Jesus had been involved in some heated debate with a Pharisee who had invited Jesus to dine with him and his dinner companions, including some lawyers. They were not happy that Jesus didn't follow the oral law by following hand-washing rituals before he sat down to eat. And in Jesus tackling the Pharisees and lawyers, he succeeded in offending them greatly. It shows us that Jesus wasn't afraid to be a controversial dinner guest, tackling his hosts and his fellow diners. After this incident, which occurred in chapter 11, verses 37 through to 52, we learned that the Pharisees became extremely hostile to Jesus and were always looking for an opportunity to cross-examine him and catch him out at every turn. That's verses 53 and 54. As we move into chapter 12, we're told that thousands gathered to hear what Jesus had to say. So many people, in fact, that they were crushing in on one another, and one can imagine the situation potentially being quite dangerous. Jesus began by talking specifically to his disciples, warning them of the hostility of the Pharisees and the need to be careful. I wonder, perhaps, if this section was aimed primarily at Luke's faith community. We don't know. What we do know in this passage is that we've got Jesus in it, obviously making his way to Jerusalem with his final roundabout journey and proclaiming with great urgency the coming of the kingdom of God in various ways, in sayings, in parables, in actions. We've got an unnamed man in the crowd. Now, generally, when people are not named in the New Testament, it's because they were not known to the early church. And this particular anonymous man wanted Jesus to settle a dispute between him and his brother about the family inheritance. As I've mentioned, we've got these huge crowds pressing in on Jesus and listening to his every word. Presumably they still included some of these Pharisees who were so hostile towards him. And finally, within the parable itself, we have the character of the rich man, who experiences some unexpected good fortune, but decides to hoard his bumper crop and not share that, which I think gets us to the crux of the parable, but more of that anon. Now, Luke's Gospel was the third of the four canonical Gospels to be written around 80 to 85 of the Common Era, and one of its major themes is the use of money. It's something Luke really seems to care about. It's helpful to keep in mind two other passages that are within the set of lectionary readings offered for this particular Sunday. Psalm 49 and Colossians 3 verses 1 to 11. These passages also tackle the subject of money and what really matters. We've become somewhat squeamish, arguably, about talking about issues to do with money in Western society. But this is a key biblical theme, and in this section, Jesus will tackle it head on. So, Jesus was teaching his disciples when he was interrupted by this anonymous man in the crowd who wanted Jesus to make a judgment in his favour, effectively. It wasn't unusual for people to go to a rabbi and seek a judgment on an issue that they were facing. But this man has obviously decided already that his cause is righteous, and he wants Jesus effectively to do as he's told and make his brother share the family inheritance with him. Now, we don't know what the circumstances were, whether this was the older brother or the younger brother or quite what was happening. But we do know that it was a huge and significant thing in Jewish society of that time. And as it can easily do today, presumably it brought out a lot of friction and difficulties within the family unit between these two brothers. Jesus, as I say, is put in a difficult position here. The man wants him to find in his favour, as it were. But as verse 14 shows us, Jesus refuses to be drawn into making that kind of judgment. And instead he warns the whole crowd, and this man in particular, against greed of all kinds. And he tells them, as we see in verse 15, that life doesn't actually consist in accumulating as many possessions as we can. He then launches into what's become known as the parable of the rich fool, which is introduced at the beginning of verse 16. It begins in the latter half of that verse by telling us that there was an already rich man who had some good fortune in that his land yielded a bumper crop. Now, there's no indication here that the man acquired his wealth by exploiting others or behaving illegally. And he's also not cast as being particularly greedy. Indeed, in verse 17, there seems to be an element of surprise at his good fortune. But it's something that the land has yielded. It's not something he's done, as it were. So it really is good luck. And yet, in verses 17 to 19, what we see again and again is the man thinks only of himself with a repeated use of I and my. He talks about his plans to build even bigger barns to store this excess of grain and his various goods. And therefore he has enough to be able to tell his soul to relax, to eat, drink and be merry. In other words, he has made his bumper fortune and his provision of goods really the focus of his life at this point. Now, we could argue, of course, that he was being perfectly reasonable in wanting to make provisions for the future. And indeed, I don't think Jesus is saying that we shouldn't do that we shouldn't make sensible provisions where we can. But the issue here is twofold. Firstly, that this man is so focused on himself and his own needs that it stops him using his good fortune to benefit others. There's no sense here of him being grateful to God for what's happened, and nor any sense of what God might require of him as someone who has had this good fortune. And furthermore, and secondly, he's behaving, as I've already hinted, as if his new wealth can secure his future. He's placed infinite value on this and on his personal ambitions. Yet it could not shield him from the contingency and fragility of human life. None of us can escape that. Death will come to the poor and to the wealthy alike. Indeed, it's often said along with taxes, it's the only certainty in life. In verse 20, the man is told by God that tonight, that very night, he was going to die. And of course, he could not take any of this vast accumulation of stuff with him. Therefore, when he spoke to his soul, as verse 19 put it, he failed to reckon with what really matters. In verse 20, the man is called a fool, and that word, translated as fool, only appears in one other place in Luke's Gospel, in chapter 11, verse 40, in which Jesus is tackling the Pharisees about their greed and about their neglect of justice. And it was a very strong thing to say, I think. And he concludes in this section and what follows from the parable by saying that the same fate that awaits this man in the story also awaits those who store up earthly treasure but are not rich with God, or to use the language of Matthew's Gospel, have not stored up treasures for themselves in heaven, as verse 21 puts it. Now it's interesting to note that what follows on from this in verses 22 to 34 of chapter 12, where Jesus teaches about what really matters for life, begins with the word therefore. And so it follows on from this story that Jesus has just told and the warning in that parable. Jesus recognises that what often underlies excessive accumulation is anxiety and fear. And he offers the antidote in the promise that it's the Father's good pleasure to share the life of the kingdom with all who will truly embrace it. So this is a challenging parable. It's challenging to the mindset in our capitalist Western society that focuses on accumulating more and more and more and more. It's a challenge to those of us who may get anxious about not having enough and store up more than we need as a result. It's also a very difficult passage to grapple with in the midst of a cost of living crisis when so many don't have enough. It perhaps challenges those of us who do to use our good fortune, and often it is good fortune rather than necessarily meritocracy, to help others. We grapple with these questions and more as we now turn to the set questions for this week.